Hi guys, my name is Marsha and I'm a second year medical student studying at Oxford, and today we're going to be talking about Oxbridge medical interviews. So it's pretty well known that Oxbridge interviews can be brutal, especially for a subject like medicine. So today I'm going to be giving you guys some tips to hopefully make the whole interview process a bit easier when the time comes around. So Oxford and Cambridge are one of the few medical schools that still do panel interviews, and that means during your interview you'll be faced with around 3 or 4 professors for between half an hour to 40 minutes, who will essentially be asking you different types of questions. Now, this can sound pretty daunting at first, but actually it can be a really enjoyable experience. And this is because essentially you're having a conversation with people who are at the top of the fields and are passionate about what they do. Now, Oxbridge interviews typically cover 3 types of questions, especially for medicine. So the first area is motivation for medicine. So they kind of usually start off by asking you some general kind of medical interview questions, your things like why medicine, why not other healthcare professions, what are the important qualities of a doctor, so kind of the standard questions where kind of most medical schools ask 1 or 2 of these, and just to gauge kind of your reasons for wanting to study medicine and to make sure that you are really devoted to wanting to study medicine. The second type of question that you get asked is kind of encompasses medical ethics and NHS hot topics. So you will usually be given some sort of ethical scenario or be asked something about the NHS, and you need some kind of previous knowledge about these things to be able to navigate these scenarios. The third type of question is science questions, and these are dreaded by many students. Now, hopefully later in the video I'll be giving you some tips to help you cope with each of these types of questions that you'll encounter in most Oxbridge medical interviews. So, to make this seemingly daunting hurdle in the medical school application process a bit easier, let's get straight into the tips. Tip number 1 is think of the interview as a conversation. So, Oxbridge medical interviews can be really unpredictable. While they ask you some standard questions that you might be able to predict, a lot of the questions may be curveballs or maybe things that you will not have come across or heard of before. Now, when this happens, it's important that you're able to think on your feet. A lot of students sometimes get completely thrown off or phased when they get asked, a question that is about something they've never even considered or thought of before. In these kind of interviews, it's really important that you take your time, maybe take a pause to kind of think about the question and give a succinct and logical answer, much like in a conversation, where you may have not come across the topic of your conversation before. So what I tend to recommend is when you're asked a difficult question or a question that you've never considered before, try to take a pause and take a minute to actually process the question and think about some of the points you're going to make. That will help you make your answers in a much more well-framed and well-ordered way. A big mistake students sometimes make is they just start speaking straight away after the question is asked. And this can mean they sometimes ramble and make loads of different points that aren't really interconnected. And when this happens, the interviewers tend to interrupt to get you back on track, and obviously that's less than ideal. So try to take a pause, take a minute to think about what the question is, and only start answering once you kind of know what direction you want to take it in. Building on this idea, tip number 2 is practice thinking out loud. So, as we mentioned before, Oxbridge tend to ask science questions in their medical interviews. Now, unfortunately, this is likely to be science that you haven't encountered before. So what they usually do is they start off by introducing a topic that you may have come across at A level, and they then start building on this and asking more and more challenging questions. And essentially, what they're looking for is for you to be able to use some of the knowledge that you already have and be able to apply it to a new and different situation. So bear in mind that they do not expect you to know all the answers, not at all. It's actually what they're looking for is your ability to think and kind of come to a conclusion using logic and some previous knowledge and synthesize some new ideas that may help you find a solution to a problem. So rather than looking for someone who knows all the answers, they are looking for someone who can think logically and come up with potential answers. So when trying to answer these type of science questions where where it's likely that you haven't come across the science, it's important to think out loud. That's because you really want to show the interviewers your thought process. Thinking out loud can help you do this because they can essentially see the steps of thoughts that you're taking, and essentially if you come to the wrong answer, they can then see where exactly you took the wrong step. And that's really useful because, as I said, essentially they're looking for your ability to think. And being able to verbalize your thoughts out loud shows them your thinking process and the logic behind your answer. The interviewers are not looking for people who know all the answers. They're looking for people who can apply ideas logically and come to some sort of answer in the end. It's even been said that if interviewers sometimes feel like the person knows too much about a certain topic, they will start asking them different questions because they're not looking for someone to be able to just recall facts that they've memorized. They want to really get you to think and actually try to put your ideas together and, come up with some potential answers to the question. You can try to practice thinking out loud by getting someone to ask you a really abstract question and then trying to synthesize some ideas and verbalize them. So, for example, something like, why are our shoulder joints different to our hip joints? And why is this important? You can try to think about the different ideas you could come up with as to why this may be significant and just verbalize them as you're thinking it through. Now, tip number 3 is don't be afraid to ask questions. At some points in the interview, you will come across, inevitably, some scenarios or some questions where you're just not sure of how to proceed. Now, in these situations, it's important that you're not afraid to ask questions. You can ask the interviewers to rephrase or repeat, or even just repeat your understanding of what they've said, just to make sure that you've kind of understood the general gist of what they're saying. So it's actually really, really useful for you to be able to ask questions because it shows the interviewers that you're engaged and that you're motivated to try to solve the problem. So it's a better alternative than to just saying, I'm not sure. The idea would be saying, I'm not sure, which is, of course, is absolutely fine, but then following that up with a question. Because it really shows the interviewers that you're not giving up. It shows the interviewers that you're not giving up. You understand that you do not quite have the answer, but you're willing to try to work through and gather more information to try to make some sort of hypothesis. And that's really, really important because it shows that you're perseverant and that you don't just give up straight away. Tip number 4 is enjoy the process. My final tip would be to enjoy the process of Oxbridge medical interviews. Out of all the medical school interviews I had, my Oxford interview was by far my favourite. I came out of the interview thinking that it was a really interesting 40 minutes and that I really enjoyed the conversations we had. And I definitely think that it's a really, really good experience because think about it. Essentially, it's just a conversation with people who really know what they're talking about. Essentially, they'll be bringing up ideas and thoughts, and what they want is for you to think through them and present some of your ideas back. So essentially, it's just a really interesting and pretty fun conversation with people who really know what they're talking about. So I really enjoyed it, and I do think most people really do enjoy their interviews, especially if they're passionate about this subject that they want to study. So while the interviews may seem daunting, I think it's really, really important to stay positive and try to go into it with the mindset that you will enjoy the interview. I think it's really, really visible, especially from the perspective of the interviewers, when someone wants to be there because they're more engaged and they're more willing to participate in what the interviewers are trying to achieve, essentially. So I think that can be really, really effective for your interview if you go into it with a positive mindset and with the mindset that you want to enjoy the process rather than being scared of it. Overall, I hope that was useful for those of you thinking about applying to medicine at Oxbridge and for those of you who have done so already. I wish you guys the best of luck with your preparation, and I hope that you stay tuned for more content on applying to medicine at Oxbridge and medical interviews. Thank you guys.